Adam Clarke was a native of Moybeg near Macará, but in 1779 lived at Kappa, close to Flowerfield House in Portrush. Following his conversion to faith in God, Adam Clarke preached in the immediate area. He'd been apprenticed to a Coleraine draper called Bennett, but in 1782, on the recommendation of the superintendent of the Londonderry Circuit, he was invited to England by John Wesley to take up training, and in September of that year became a Methodist preacher in the Bradford-upon-Avon Circuit near Bath in Wiltshire. He was to serve only 11 months probation, less than a quarter of the usual period, before being accepted into full connection, the youngest man to receive this degree of approval at the Methodist Conference of 1783. From then he served as an itinerant preacher in various circuits until the appointment as superintendent in Bristol in 1789. And in 1790 he was appointed superintendent in Dublin, a position regarded as the most superior in all of Ireland. Clarke was a man of exceptional ability, and in 1795 he was appointed to London. Clarke had been gaining a reputation as a classical scholar, and here he began his vast range of literary works, a huge 6-volume commentary covering every book of the Bible, Persian, Hebrew and Greek grammars, a history of the Wellesley family, and many more. His scholarly reputation continued to grow, and in 1802 he was then asked to help decipher the Rosetta Stone, which was eventually found to contain the key to the understanding of Egyptian hieroglyphics. In 1806, he was elected for the first time to the presidency of the Methodist Conference, and in the same year was appointed a member of the Committee of the British and Foreign Bible Society. He helped in the preparation of Arabic, Syriac, and Greek language Bibles, and also advocated the printing of the Bible in Irish. He was in the forefront of the government of the church, and as a member of many learned societies, he had contact with many eminent people. He was thus in a position to wield considerable influence. It had become a habit of Dr. Clarke on each of his excursions to Ireland to visit his boyhood haunts. He did so in 1816, again in 1823, and about 1830 decided to settle in Portrush when he retired. From 1825, Dr. Clarke had responsibility for the work of the Methodist Church in the Shetland Islands. They found the needs of these people there as much material and educational as spiritual, and set out to answer them by setting up schools as well as churches. In 1830, about the time he was thinking of returning to his native shore, he was implored by Mr. Harper, the superintendent of Coleraine, to begin a similar work in the northmost parts of Ireland. All things came together: Dr. Clarke's ability and influence, his feelings for his native country, and his inclination to settle there. It was decided to establish 6 schools in places around Coleraine where no school existed or where any class of religious people were made to attempt to educate the poor. These schools were to be at Cashel near McCuskey, Prolusk near Ballintoy, Lisson near Ballycastle, Billy near Bushmills, Goran near Acadui, and as Dr. Clarke later wrote, on the seacoast parts of the county Antrim, Portrush and its vicinities, where there was a large and rapidly increasing population, owing to the enlarging of the port and carrying out breakwater to defend it, and where for miles there was no school of any kind, nor any sort of institution, and where consequently ignorance and vice had almost an uncontrolled sway. Of the 6 places chosen, Dr. Clarke wrote, "The Portrush district seems to be the most destitute of all, and therefore I beg the Reverend S. Harper to procure for me a proper teacher for a school in that place. And as the excellent persons who had wished me to enter into the labour of love desired me, if possible, to procure Methodist local preachers as teachers of the schools, in order that they might, by their qualifications, be capable instructors of the children, and by their grace and endowments be no less able to spread religious knowledge amongst the parents, I entreated Mr. H. to look for men suitable in all these respects." Even in 1831, Mr. Harper reported to Dr. Clarke, "Dear Doctor, we have commenced our school in Portrush. The people were growing impatient, and although it blew a hurricane and was piercingly cold, 37 children came and were for the most part accompanied by their parents. I mentioned to them your object and what you, assisted by some English friends, contemplated the regulations for attendance, etc. All these things were cordially agreed to, and although the weather from that time has been unusually severe, the children are increasing in number rapidly. The teacher has commenced his labours in the fear of God and is remarkably well received both as a master and a public Christian teacher. In April 1831, Adam Clarke himself visited the schools. From the descriptions in his journal, the people and children of Portrush had undergone a miraculous change under the influence of the school and its schoolmaster preacher. The children were clean, even to their bare feet, all 80 of them, about an equal number of boys and girls. And they were all behaving with the utmost decorum. Wicked words are no longer heard, and decency of behaviour is everywhere observable. This change was attested by some of the principal inhabitants who bore witness to the great good produced by this school, not solely amongst the children, but also amongst the parents. Dr. Clarke was at this time attempting to improve the accommodation. I am struggling hard to get them a piece of ground in which a chapel and schoolhouse may be erected, and I believe that I shall ultimately succeed. Whilst he was pleased with the spiritual development of the children, he was gratified also by the educational success of the enterprise. The children are now brought under teaching and discipline, all learning to read and improving rapidly. Several were acquiring writing and casting accounts. The building was begun in the spring of 1832, and despite illness, Dr. Clarke visited it, the only one of the schools his illness allowed him to do. June the 14th, I proposed to attempt a visit to Portrush and Port Stewart. I got to the place where the edifice, where it's intended for a chapel and schoolhouse, is now at the square in the building and looks well. He did not see the town or his school again. He returned to England and died in September. Shortly before his death, he received reports from the master of his Irish schools, amongst them one James Devers of Portrush, stating that the construction of the new school continued. It also remarked that as the existing location of the school was too small, the children were taught out of doors during fine weather, and out of a total register of 100 pupils, the average attendance was some 74. Following Adam Clarke's death, the chapel school and the others in the area were handed over to the missionary committee of the Methodist Church, who had them inspected by the Reverend Elijah Hole. He found Portrush impressive. None of the schools already mentioned present a more imposing or interesting appearance than that of Portrush. In some respect exceeds them all. The schoolroom and the chapel, for it answers both purposes, attract the attention on entering Portrush on the road from Coleraine. It is a neat and substantial stone building, 42 feet long and 32 feet broad in the clear. The entrance, which looks out upon the northern sea, is by several stone steps, on which rests a portico of very neat appearance. The roof is of slate and leaded. The whole is surmounted by a handsome belfry supported by pillars, which the doctor promises to furnish with a bell of superior tone which he had received from Russia. Portrush Methodist Church is one of a very few Methodist churches in Ireland to have a bell. Its arrival here was the result of a suggestion by the redoubtable lady Rebecca Rice. She commented to Dr. Clarke that all was needed to complete a chapel school was a bell to fill the little cupola on its roof. He is said to have paused a short time and then said that he had a bell, which had been given to him by the Duke of Newcastle, and which it was supposed to have been given to the Earl of Durham, who was the Russian ambassador, by Alexander I, the Tsar of Russia. The bell must have been for a lengthy period in the possession of the Russian imperial family, as it was manufactured in Amsterdam in the year 1681. As it was presented to Dr. Clarke for the use of the Methodist Church, he said he would give it to Miss Rice for the use of the Church of Portrush. This bell has provided a tangible and audible link with the Portrush Methodist Church founder ever since. It hung in the chapel school, and it now hangs in the vestibule of the present church in a position where its famous inscription may readily read. 1681, Franciscus Lillian Mamnus Frey me facet Amsterdam.